I never imagined that a single day at work would change everything. It was a typical Tuesday, and I was in the middle of a meeting when, out of nowhere, an excruciating pain exploded in my head. It wasn't like a migraine or anything that gave me warning. It was like someone had stuck a knife in my brain and twisted it. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor, unable to scream. The voices around me became distant, as if I were underwater, and my vision went black in seconds. The last thing I remembered was the frightened face of a colleague approaching, but I couldn't respond. My body had shut down, but somehow I was still there. That's when I realized I was floating above my own body. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. I saw myself down there, motionless, with the team trying to revive me. And the strangest thing, I didn't feel afraid. There was an absurd peace in that situation, as if everything was part of something bigger. But at the same time, a force began to pull me away from there, as if I were a magnet being attracted to something. And then it appeared. A tunnel, but it wasn't dark. It was bathed in a golden light that didn't hurt the eyes. It was warm, alive, as if every particle of it was filled with love. And I knew without having to think that he was there. When I entered the tunnel, it was like being enveloped by something I can't quite describe. It wasn't wind, it wasn't water, it was like the light itself was carrying me. And the further I went, the stronger that presence became. Until suddenly, he was there. Jesus. He wasn't a figure from a religious painting. He didn't have a long beard or flowing white clothes. He was pure light, but with a form that my mind could recognize as a person. His eyes, my God, his eyes were so deep, as if he saw everything I had ever done, everything I was, and yet there was no judgment, only love, a love that hurt, because I knew I didn't deserve it. He didn't speak with words, but I understood, as if his every thought was implanted directly into my soul, and the first thing that came was a sadness so heavy it almost crushed me. It wasn't for me, it was for everything. All over the world, all over people running to nowhere, fighting over things that wouldn't matter in 5 minutes. And then the vision came, March 2025. Not as a magical date, but as a turning point. I saw chaos, people screaming in the streets, empty shelves, news reports of collapse, and no one knowing what to do. I saw earthquakes tearing cities apart like they were made of paper, and the worst part, people blaming everything but themselves. What broke my heart the most was seeing empty churches. Not physically empty, but filled with people who only repeated meaningless words. People fighting for power within the congregations, pastors more concerned with money than souls, and families, my God, families, torn apart by stupid arguments, children against parents, siblings betraying siblings over politics or inheritance. It was as if everyone had forgotten what really matters. But in the midst of this chaos, I saw small groups hidden away, people praying in basements, elderly people who kept their faith even when they were being persecuted, young people who risked everything to protect others. They shone in the darkness. Jesus showed me something that still gives me chills. Demons. They weren't movie monsters, but subtle things, manipulating important people. They whispered in the ears of leaders, fueling hatred and division. The worst part, most people didn't even realize it. People thought they were just ideas and opinions, but I saw the dark strings pulling them toward destruction. And the angels, they were fighting, yes, but they respected our free will. You could see the pain in them when someone chose evil knowing it was evil. Then Jesus said to me, not with a voice but directly in my spirit, "Sarah, you shouldn't have died today. Come back and tell me." Before I could process what was happening, I was enveloped in a new vision, this time of what could be. I saw cities being rebuilt, families being reconciled, people dropping everything to help strangers. There was a peace so strong that even the air felt different. But then came the part that broke me. This will only happen if many people repent, I was shown. Not a repentance of words, but the kind that hurts, that makes you kneel and cry on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. The kind that changes everything. And then I understood why Jesus was so sad. He already knew that many would not choose this path. Suddenly, I felt a violent tug. It was like being ripped from the safest place in the universe and thrown back into a nightmare. The pain came back all at once, the physical pain of my broken body, but even worse, the pain of having to go back after knowing what I know. I opened my eyes in the hospital, with doctors shouting, "She's back!" But all I could do was cry. They weren't tears of joy. They were the weight of that message that now lived inside me. The nurse said I had been dead for almost 4 minutes, but for me it had been an eternity. My whole body ached, but the pain in my soul was 1,000 times worse because I had seen the truth, and now I had to live with it. In the following days, I tried to tell the people closest to me what I had experienced. My husband was scared. He looked at me as if I had gone crazy. Some friends stopped visiting me. Others made jokes saying that I had tripped on morphine, but the worst was at church. When I tried to share with the pastor, he interrupted me saying that God does not scare people with apocalyptic visions. I felt a lump in my throat. How could someone who supposedly knows the Bible ignore so many warnings that were written there? That's when I understood that many people do not want the truth. They want comfort. Little by little, I realized it wasn't about convincing everyone. A few people actually listened to me. An elderly neighbor who cried silently, a teenager who came to me after church, wanting to know more. They were the ones who were still hungry for something real. I started writing everything down in an old notebook. Every detail, every feeling, every piece of the visions. I knew that one day it would make sense to someone. The strangest thing? Ever since that day, I can tell when darkness is at work. It's like a bad smell that only I can smell, or a tightness in my chest when I enter certain places. Jesus gave me eyes to see, and now I can no longer pretend I don't see it. The world went on as if nothing had happened. People continued to fight over politics, hoard useless things, live as if they had 1,000 years ahead of them. But I can't live like that anymore. Ever since that day, March 2025 has hung over me like a silent warning. It's not about setting dates, it's about being ready. Sometimes when I'm at the grocery store or in traffic, I look at the people around me and wonder, how many of these people will be ready when the chaos hits? The message was clear. It wouldn't be the end, but a new beginning for those willing to humble themselves and change. Today, I live between two worlds. The physical world, where I pay bills and take my children to school, and the spiritual world, which has never been the same since that light. I am not special. I was just chosen to see and tell. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still feel the warmth of that tunnel and the peace that does not exist here. But he brought me back for a reason. So I keep talking, even when people laugh at me, writing even if few people read it. Because if at least one person truly repents after listening to me, it was all worth it. The rest is up to him. I am done. When Jesus said, "Come back," I felt a panic that didn't exist in that place. It was my human self wanting to stay. The light began to recede, and I tried to hold on to it. But my hands, or what I thought were hands, passed right through. The darkness of the physical world engulfed me again like a dirty whirlpool, and with it came physical sensations. First a high-pitched ringing in my ears, then unpleasant hospital smells of antiseptic and blood. My chest burned as if someone had driven a hot iron between my ribs. It was life returning to a body that had already begun to die. The first sound I heard was a heart monitor beeping wildly and a doctor's voice shouting, "We have rhythm!" My tongue was swollen and bitter, and when I tried to open my eyes, the white light of the emergency room cut through me like a knife. Everything hurt, but the worst pain was the absence, as if part of my soul had been ripped out. I cried helplessly, Not out of joy, but out of mourning for the peace I had lost. The nurses thought they were tears of gratitude for being alive, but I knew the truth. Part of me had remained forever in that light, and now it carried a secret too heavy for a human body. My vision was blurry, but I could make out the nurse's face bent over me. Her eyes were watery. I later learned that she had pronounced me dead minutes earlier. When I tried to speak, all that came out was a hoarse croak. My throat was destroyed by the tube they'd inserted. The nurse squeezed my hand tightly and whispered, "Welcome back." But all I could think about was the message that was burning inside me. Every breath hurt, as if my body was no longer the right home for my soul after what I'd experienced outside. For the next few minutes, as the doctors ran tests, I stared at the white hospital ceiling. It looked so artificial compared to the light I had seen. I remembered one bizarre detail. A corner of the paint was peeling off, forming a shape that resembled an angel. I stared at it, trying to hold on to whatever piece of the vision was slipping from my memory like sand through my fingers. My human mind was already starting to rationalize. Maybe it was just a lack of oxygen to the brain, but my spirit knew the truth. Something inside me had changed forever, and no medical test would explain what really happened in those 4 minutes. The first night in the hospital was the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the visions. Buildings collapsing, people running in panic, darkness creeping through the crowd. I would wake with a start at the slightest noise, sweat running down my face. A nurse noticed my condition and offered me a sedative, but I refused. I was afraid that if I slept, I would forget some important detail of the message. I lay there, clutching the rough hospital blanket, mentally replaying every word, every image, as if I were memorizing a survival map. In the early hours of the morning, when the hospital fell silent, something happened that I had never told anyone about. I felt a familiar warmth near my bed, the same warmth as the light in the tunnel. I didn't see anything, but I heard it clearly, as if someone were whispering in my ear. "Don't be afraid. You are not alone." At that moment, such intense relief washed over me that tears flowed without stopping. It was confirmation that everything had been real, that he was still with me, even there in that cold, white place. I took the glass of water from the nightstand with trembling hands and drank it slowly, knowing that my life, from that moment on, would never be the same again. The sunrise that day seemed different, more intense, as if the light was trying to remind me of something. As the doctors ran new tests, I noticed details that I would have missed before. The nurse who held my hand gently as she drew blood. The elderly man in the bed next to me who was praying softly. Even the bird that landed on my window for a moment. It was as if I could now see through a lens that highlighted every divine spark hidden in the ordinary world. But along with it came anguish. How many people went through life without ever realizing this? How many were so distracted that they didn't even notice the warnings until it was too late? When I was discharged, the doctor insisted that I had been incredibly lucky. He said that aneurysms like mine didn't give second chances. I nodded politely, but deep down, I knew there was no luck at all, only purpose. As I walked out of the hospital, the sunlight hit me like a shock. I stepped slowly onto the asphalt, feeling the rough texture beneath my bare feet. They had lost my shoes in the ER. Every sensation was now a miracle. The wind, the smell of coffee from the bakery, the sound of cars passing by. Ordinary life felt sacred, but at the same time it carried a terrible weight. How could I return to everyday life after having seen what I had seen? How could I live with the secret of what was to come? Over the next few months, I tried to readjust, but it was like living in two worlds at once. At family gatherings, at work, at the supermarket, I would look at people and see beyond their social masks. I could see the emptiness in their eyes, the spiritual hunger masked by shopping and gossip. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, a memory of the visions would hit me like a punch in the stomach, and I would have to hide in the bathroom to take a deep breath. My faith was no longer the same, not the Sunday religion of memorized prayers, but something visceral, urgent, like holding a bleeding heart in my hands. Today, years later, I still wake up some nights with the taste of metal in my mouth, reliving the pain of the aneurysm. But I also have the vivid memory of that light, more real than anything I've experienced before or since. I don't have easy answers, nor do I preach on street corners. I just know that when the chaos begins, when people look around in confusion, I will be among those who, even though they tremble with fear, will recognize the call behind the collapse. And maybe, just maybe, I will be able to help someone see the light in the darkness. I'm done. In the first few months after the experience, I developed an uncanny sensitivity. I could sense when someone around me was going through a turning point. It was as if I could see luminous threads connecting people to invisible choices. Once, at the grocery store, I approached a random woman and simply said, "He's still waiting for you." She burst into tears at the checkout. Those weren't my words. They came out without me thinking. Afterward, I was confused, trying to understand how I knew that. My husband began to look at me with growing concern, as if he feared I had developed some kind of disorder. The night visions got worse. Sleep became a battlefield. Vivid dreams of cities burning, people crawling through rubble, children crying for parents who would never return. I would wake with my heart racing, my sheets soaked in sweat. I began to avoid the news because every real tragedy seemed to echo my nightmares. My therapist diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, but the medication only dulled the pain, not erased the memory of what I had known. The worst part was seeing bits of the visions come true on a small scale. Strikes, natural disasters, growing polarization. How could I explain that I recognized these signs? One night, when I was at my wit's end, something happened that changed everything again. I was in my backyard looking at the stars when a sudden peace enveloped me. It wasn't a vision, just an absolute certainty that came over me. It's not the when that matters, it's the how. I realized right away that I was focusing too much on the catastrophes and missing the point. The next day, I threw away the notebook where I detailed my predictions and started a new one. This time about simple acts of love that could change destinies. The elderly neighbor who needed company, the troubled teenager down the street, the overwhelmed single mother. These were the real battles. Over time, I learned to live between two worlds without going crazy. When the anguish of the visions got to me, I focused on the concrete, bringing soup to a sick person, listening to someone who needed to vent, staying silent with someone who was suffering. I discovered that small acts of daily courage were just as important as warning about the future. My home became a refuge for the lost who felt that something was wrong in the world but didn't know what. They came without knowing why, and often left with tears in their eyes but lighter. I simply shared my story when they asked, without any drama. The biggest test came when my own teenage son, influenced by his friends, began calling me a religious nut. Instead of arguing, I simply continued to love him, leaving the gate open when he stormed out, placing a plate of hot food when he returned. One morning he came into my room crying after a terrible nightmare. "I dreamed that everything was falling apart and I couldn't find you," he confessed. I held him like I had when he was little, without saying, "I told you so." The next day, he began asking me honest questions for the first time. It was my greatest victory, not convincing anyone, but holding the door open when they needed it. March 2025 came and went without the apocalypse many feared. Some who had believed in me were disappointed, even angry, but I knew that the dates were never the important thing. It was about the change of heart. I saw small miracles happen in the ordinary chaos of life. Addictions abandoned, unexpected reconciliations, unthinkable acts of Generosity. The collapse did come, but slowly, in the way people chose to live each day. The great tragedies were just symptoms of something deeper that began in each person's soul. And yet there was light in unexpected places, quietly enduring. Now, when I look back, I see that the real message was never about fear. That light at the end of the tunnel showed me the worst possible thing, yes, but it also gave me the simplest prescription: to live with radical love in the ordinary. I am no prophet nor a saint, just a survivor who has learned to read the signs. I still have days of despair when the weight of what I know seems too great. But then I remember the warmth of that presence, the silent promise in the hospital, and I keep going. The world may be slowly falling apart, but there is still time for small acts of courage. And sometimes it is those small fires that keep the darkness from winning completely. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this story, it's this: pay attention to the signs within you. I'm not talking about dramatic visions, but that quiet voice that knows when you're on the wrong path. The future is not fixed. It's shaped by every choice we make today, right now. My near-death experience wasn't a horror show to scare you, but a loving wake-up call. Wake up while there's still time. Will chaos come? Yes. But amid the rubble, there will always be outstretched hands, lights in the darkness, and the chance to start over. I'm done.